Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we explore the systems, strategies, and science driving the life sciences industry forward. I'm Anna.
And I'm Eric. Today, we're diving into a topic that sits at the core of every successful regulated product, even though most people never see it: engineering. Not just the technical work itself, but the engineering discipline required to make a product compliant, scalable, and ready for FDA or global regulatory review.
Exactly. Companies come to Emma International with breakthrough ideas, such as for a new SAMD tool, a next generation diagnostic, a sterile injectable process, a Class 2 device that needs a redesign. But having a strong concept isn't enough. In this industry, you don't succeed unless your engineering is aligned with compliance, validation, and quality requirements.
And that's the role Emma plays. We're not an engineering manufacturer. We don't build equipment or operate production lines. We support the companies who do. We partner with life science teams to ensure their engineering activities hold up to regulatory scrutiny and operate reliably from day one.
Let's start with the backbone of everything: CQV, commissioning, qualification, and validation. It may not sound glamorous, but it's one of the most critical steps in getting a facility or product cleared.
Absolutely. You can have the best equipment, the most innovative process, or a pristine clean room, but if you can't prove that it works consistently and compliantly, the FDA will not sign off. Our team supports companies through protocol development, IQ, OQ, and PQ execution, process validation, method validation, and computer system validation. It's the foundation of trust.
And the challenge for companies is volume and precision. Every step has to be documented, every deviation investigated, every requirement traced. When teams get overwhelmed, that's where Emma steps in to keep everything on track and audit ready.
Then there's automation and control systems, an area that's grown massively in the last few years. Modern life science facilities depend on SCADA systems, PLCs, automated data collection, and digital environmental monitoring. But automation introduces data integrity risks if it's not validated correctly.
Exactly. We help evaluate system architecture, perform SCADA and PLC programming support, validate data flows, and ensure the automation layer meets FDA expectations around audit trails, access control, and electronic records. Automation is powerful, but in regulated environments, it must be controlled.
Process engineering is another big area. Companies often reach a point where a process works in the lab but falls apart during scale up or tech transfer. Or the process is technically sound but not compliant with GMP expectations.
We support teams through process optimization, scale up planning, technology transfer, and validation. One of the most common issues we see is that companies underestimate how much documentation and design control is required to translate a process into a regulatory ready state.
Facility engineering is another huge one. With reshoring, expansions, and new modalities, companies are building or retrofitting facilities at a faster rate than ever. Clean rooms, utilities, HVAC, environmental monitoring, all of it must be designed with regulatory compliance baked in, not bolted on later.
And we help teams evaluate facility layouts, perform design reviews, support commissioning, and ensure everything meets GMP expectations before a single batch is run. A well designed facility prevents a lot of pain later.
And then there's design engineering, supporting product development through feasibility, design and development planning, risk analysis under ISO 14971, verification and validation activities, and ensuring everything fits within 21 CFR Part 820 or ISO 13485 requirements.
Exactly. Tools like requirements mapping, risk management files, usability studies, they're not optional. They're what ensure a product withstands regulatory review.
Software engineering support is also a growing segment. With SAMD and software-enabled devices taking off, the need for compliant software development has skyrocketed. We help teams with architecture planning, verification and validation, cybersecurity considerations, CSV, and alignment with IEC 62304.
And this brings us to the real theme of today's episode. Engineering isn't separate from compliance. Engineering is compliance. When companies try to treat engineering as an afterthought, regulatory trouble is right around the corner.
That's why EMA International's engineering services exist, to bridge that gap. From concept to commercialization, we help ensure that innovation is matched with the technical rigor regulators expect.
And today, we're going to break down exactly how that works, why it matters, and how companies can build engineering strategies that accelerate, not slow down, their path to market.
One thing companies often underestimate is how early engineering decisions impact the entire regulatory and quality lifecycle. A design choice made in the prototype phase can determine whether validation takes 3 weeks or 3 months, whether a facility passes inspection on the first try or ends up facing corrective actions.
Exactly. That's why our support often starts earlier than people expect. Teams will come to us thinking they need help with validation, but when we start peeling back the layers, we discover upstream issues, missing user requirements, unclear design inputs, misaligned process parameters, or equipment that wasn't selected with GMP compliance in mind.
And that's where engineering intersects with strategy. Because at EMA International, we don't just help companies fix problems, we help them prevent them. Something as simple as writing a proper URS for equipment can save tens of thousands of dollars during qualification. Something like selecting a vendor that already meets applicable 21 CFR or ISO standards can shave months off a project.
Another area where companies struggle is technology transfer. Moving a process from R&D to manufacturing or from one site to another seems straightforward, but it's one of the most failure-prone stages in product development.
That's true across pharmaceuticals, biologics, diagnostics, medical devices, everywhere. Without structured engineering support, tech transfer becomes a scramble. Unclear critical parameters, missing process data, undocumented risk assessments, donor site and receiving site misalignment. We're often brought in to create order out of that chaos.
We help teams define the process, identify critical quality attributes, build transfer protocols, and establish the validation framework before a single batch is produced. It turns messy handoffs into structured, auditable transitions.
And then there's the workforce angle. Many startups and mid-sized companies just don't have the engineering capacity to manage these activities in-house. Or they have great scientists, but not enough validation specialists or automation engineers.
That's where our flexible support models really help. Some clients embed our engineers into their teams for short term execution, others rely on us for ongoing engineering governance, and others use us on a project by project basis, commissioning a facility build, supporting a remediation effort, or guiding a product through design verification.
And because our teams come from life sciences, everything we do is filtered through the lens of compliance. Engineers who come from other industries often underestimate how regulatory driven this work is. In consumer tech or general manufacturing, you can fix it later. In regulated manufacturing, later doesn't exist. Everything must be controlled and documented in real time.
Data integrity is the perfect example of this. In automation projects, we routinely support companies who didn't realize their SCADA system wasn't storing audit trails correctly, or their PLC logs weren't protected from modification, or their access controls didn't meet Part 11 expectations. These aren't minor issues. They're findings that could derail an inspection.
Exactly. That's why we approach automation validation with the same rigor as traditional CSV. User requirements, vendor assessments, risk assessments, software validation, cybersecurity considerations, and full documentation of logic, changes, and configuration.
On the facility engineering side, we're seeing massive growth in projects tied to expansions, retrofits, and reshoring. Companies are moving operations back to the US or increasing capacity for biologics or building new clean rooms for sterile manufacturing. They need verification of HVAC systems, controlled environments, utilities, water systems, and environmental monitoring solutions that meet FDA and USP expectations.
And these projects can be overwhelming for companies on their own. Coordinating vendors, contractors, commissioning teams, and regulatory expectations simultaneously. We help orchestrate the entire process. Sometimes we act as technical leads, other times as validation partners, or as quality oversight. Whatever the model, the goal is simple: get the facility ready, compliant, and operational as efficiently as possible.
Another big area is continuous improvement. Even after a facility is validated, engineering work continues. New equipment gets installed, processes evolve, automation is updated, and software systems change. Every change requires impact assessments, revalidation, and documentation that fits within the existing QMS.
That's where companies often fall behind, especially smaller ones. If engineering changes outpace document control, quality teams get overwhelmed, and the risk of non-compliance skyrockets. We help bridge that gap, ensuring iterative improvement stays compliant.
And all of this connects back to one central theme. Engineering is the backbone of quality. You can't build a strong compliance system on top of weak engineering. That's why companies partner with Emma, because aligning engineering with regulatory expectations isn't easy, and doing it wrong can cost millions.
In the next segment, we're going deeper into real-world examples, the kinds of engineering challenges companies face every day, and how strategic engineering support can make the difference between a delayed launch and a successful, compliant one.
One of the most eye opening things for companies is how often engineering issues show up later as quality issues. A mislabeled valve, an undocumented equipment change, a control system that was modified during troubleshooting. These seem small in the moment, but they can trigger massive findings during an FDA inspection.
And what usually happens is this: teams are moving fast. They're trying to get a process running, and engineering decisions don't always make their way back into the quality system. Then suddenly, you discover that half the documentation doesn't reflect reality. That's when companies bring us in, and we end up unraveling a tangle of mismatched SOPs, outdated system drawings, missing validation evidence, and equipment histories that don't match operations.
That's why our approach always starts with establishing discipline. You can't scale engineering support unless change control, documentation, and validation practices are aligned. Even the most sophisticated automation system will fail an audit if the data path isn't fully documented or if configuration changes weren't controlled.
And it's not just FDA expectations. EMA, Health Canada, PMDA, and even WHO GMP all expect engineering controls and quality alignment to be seamless. For example, many companies underestimate how much regulators expect visibility into utilities. Water for injection, WFI, compressed clean air, steam systems, these are often the backbone of a facility, but they're also common sources of deviation.
That's true, especially in legacy facilities. We've supported companies where the facility had been expanded multiple times over 20 years, and each expansion added new piping, new HVAC sections, or patched together utilities. Companies are shocked when we show them how much critical infrastructure has drifted from original specs.
That's where engineering assessments come in. We evaluate not just what equipment exists, but how it performs, how it's documented, and how it fits into future regulatory expectations. Sometimes the recommendation is simple: replace a failing sensor or revalidate a system. Other times it means redesigning entire workflows to eliminate contamination risks or inefficiencies.
And speaking of risks, let's talk about cleaning validation. That's a huge pain point for companies scaling manufacturing. They either overdo it, creating unnecessarily burdensome protocols, or they underdo it and miss critical residues or drug carryover risks.
Right. We help them strike the right balance by applying risk-based, scientifically justified approaches. That means identifying worst-case scenarios, selecting appropriate sampling locations, defining acceptance criteria, and validating cleaning processes that are robust without being overly restrictive.
And then there's automation. Companies often invest in advanced systems, SCADA, MES, robotics, without fully understanding how these systems must fit into a validated environment. The technology might be cutting edge, but if the audit trail isn't Part 11 compliant or the system doesn't maintain data integrity, it becomes a liability.
That's where our automation validation work is so important. We validate control systems, perform software testing, analyze data integrity pathways, and align everything with existing quality requirements. Sometimes the biggest contribution we make is simply helping teams understand how automation connects to regulatory expectations.
And that brings us to process engineering. This is one of the most powerful areas for impact because when processes are optimized, everything downstream improves: quality, cost, speed, and compliance.
Absolutely. We help companies define critical process parameters, optimize batches, reduce variability, and streamline workflows. For example, in biologics manufacturing, even small adjustments to mixing speeds or culture conditions can significantly affect yield. In device manufacturing, we might optimize assembly workflows to reduce human error.
Another major area is design engineering. When companies are developing a product, whether it's a diagnostic test, a software system, a device, or a combination product, design controls are everything. If design inputs aren't clear, verification and validation become extremely painful later.
And what we see often is that companies have great technical teams but are unfamiliar with FDA's design control requirements. They'll prototype quickly, but without documenting user needs, risk analyses, or traceability. That puts them at a huge disadvantage at submission time.
We help them build the entire framework: URS, design inputs, FMEA, verification plans, validation testing, usability engineering, software requirements, everything regulators expect in a compliant design history file.
And then there's facility engineering, which is becoming a huge demand area, especially with companies expanding capacity or reshoring manufacturing. Clean room layouts, HVAC zoning, material flows, personnel flows, these design decisions determine whether the facility will pass an inspection.
Exactly. A poorly placed airlock or a flawed equipment layout can cause long term contamination risks and inefficiencies. We guide companies from layout to commissioning to validation so the facility is not only compliant but operationally smart.
The big takeaway is that engineering is more than execution, it's strategic. When companies involve Emma early, they prevent problems. When they involve us late, we solve problems. Either way, engineering shapes everything about a product's future.
In the next segment, we'll walk through examples of how this engineering support plays out, what challenges companies face, how we help them overcome barriers, and how engineering excellence becomes a competitive advantage.
One thing we see consistently is that companies underestimate just how interconnected engineering and regulatory compliance really are. A product doesn't fail because the idea was bad. It fails because a process was not controlled, a validation step was skipped, or a system wasn't designed with compliance in mind. And that's exactly where engineering support becomes transformative.
A good example is commissioning and qualification. Companies often think of CQV as a final checkbox, something you do at the end of a project. But in reality, CQV must start early. If engineers aren't documenting installation conditions, control logic, environmental requirements, or functional expectations from day one, then when it's time to validate, everything is out of sync.
We've stepped into situations where equipment was already installed, utilities were hooked up, operators had been trained, and not a single IQ and OQ document existed. That's where companies panic, because now you're trying to reverse engineer traceability, and the risk of gaps skyrockets.
Our approach is to anchor engineering activities to regulatory expectations from the beginning. Every drawing, every vendor manual, every calibration record ties into something the FDA will expect evidence for later. When clients see that alignment in action, they usually say, "Why didn't we do this sooner?"
Another major area we support is process scale-up and technology transfer. When a process moves from R&D to manufacturing, things that worked perfectly in a benchtop setting fall apart at scale. A small agitation imbalance becomes a full batch deviation. A minor temperature inconsistency becomes a yield loss. Tech transfer is one of the biggest failure points in life sciences.
That's why we conduct process characterization, define critical parameters, and build risk based validation plans before scale up begins. It prevents those costly surprises that delay production and frustrate regulators.
And when that technology transfer involves moving production to a new site, whether domestic or international, the engineering risks multiply. Facility utilities may be different. HVAC zoning may not match the original environment. Material flows may not support segregation or contamination control. We evaluate all those variables, so the new site isn't just operational, it's compliant.
A huge part of this work is automation and controls because more manufacturers are shifting to advanced systems. But with every modernization comes risk. Data pathways change, audit trails change, user permissions change. The moment you introduce automation, regulators expect Part 11 compliance, cybersecurity controls, system validation, and documented configuration management.
Many companies don't realize that updating a PLC, adding a new SCADA tag, or modifying alarm logic technically counts as a regulated system change. If it isn't controlled, it can trigger major findings during an inspection. That's why our automation validation work is so crucial. It protects the integrity of both the system and the data.
And then there's facility engineering, which is becoming more important as companies expand or move manufacturing, whether it's HVAC zoning, clean room pressurization, material flows, personnel flows, or gowning procedures. Every one of these decisions has regulatory implications.
We've reviewed facilities where the clean room layout forced operators to cross paths, creating contamination risk, or where utilities weren't mapped correctly, which caused qualification failures. Sometimes the fix is small, adjusting a pressure cascade, or adding an airlock. Other times it requires major redesign to ensure GMP readiness.
Another area clients heavily rely on us for is design engineering and design controls, especially for medical devices and diagnostics. Most companies are strong in technical design, but weaker in regulatory documentation. They create prototypes quickly, but don't document user needs, risk analyses, or verification requirements in a way the FDA accepts.
What we do is build structure around that creativity. We walk teams through defining inputs, performing risk assessments like FMEA, establishing traceability, and validating the design. That's what makes a submission strong and what protects companies from costly redesigns later.
And we're seeing similar needs in software engineering, particularly for software as a medical device, SAMD. Companies are moving fast, iterating rapidly, and often have agile teams working in real time. But agile development must still exist within a regulated framework. If code changes aren't documented and validated, the FDA sees that as a major compliance risk.
Our role is to bridge that gap, helping innovators maintain speed without sacrificing regulatory rigor. We validate software, establish cybersecurity controls, define requirements architecture, and ensure they meet FDA and IEC standards.
One thing all these engineering domains have in common is this: the biggest risk isn't the product, it's the gap between people, processes, and documentation. When those aren't aligned, even the best engineering work can become a regulatory headache.
The companies that thrive are the ones that treat engineering, quality, and regulatory strategy as one unified ecosystem. And that's exactly where Emma International steps in.
In the next segment, we'll dig deeper into real world challenges engineering teams face, what goes wrong in the field, how those problems surface during audits, and how strategic engineering support can turn risk into resilience.
As we look across everything we've discussed, CQV, automation, facility engineering, design controls, SAMD, and process optimization, there's a theme that keeps coming up. Companies don't fail because of bad science. They fail because the integration of engineering, quality, and regulatory strategy wasn't built early enough.
And that's what we see over and over again. A team has a breakthrough technology, a promising clinical application, or a strong manufacturing concept. But the execution gets tripped up by documentation gaps, unvalidated systems, incomplete design records, facility issues, or unclear process parameters. not because teams aren't talented, but because they're stretched thin, working fast, and under pressure.
That's why external engineering support is becoming not just helpful, but essential. Companies aren't looking for someone to fix things later. They're looking for someone who understands how engineering decisions ripple across validation, regulatory filings, manufacturing readiness, and inspections.
One of the biggest impacts comes during scale up. When a company moves from pilot batches to commercial batches, a single misalignment, a temperature range that was never locked down, a control loop that wasn't properly documented, or a process change that wasn't validated can trigger deviations, batch failures, or even inspection findings. We've walked into situations where a team spent millions on equipment only to realize the process wasn't transferable at all. And those situations are preventable when engineering, validation, and compliance are synchronized early. And
And that's why design engineering and design controls matter so much. It's not just about designing the product, it's about designing the evidence regulators expect. Clear user needs, risk analyses that map to design inputs, verification tied to objective criteria, validation in the right user environment, all of it has to tell a coherent story. When teams overlook that narrative, submissions become vulnerable.
another area where companies lean on us heavily is software and digital systems. With SAMD evolving rapidly and with automation now touching everything from utilities to batch review, the regulatory expectations around data integrity and cybersecurity are only getting more rigorous. Whether a company is implementing an automated fill finish line or validating a cloud based analysis platform, nothing works without a controlled, documented, validated system behind it. And if that system can't produce defensible data during an inspection, the entire product lifecycle is at risk.
But here's the part that often surprises our clients. Good engineering support does more than keep you compliant. It accelerates growth. When engineering decisions are built on a foundation of quality and regulatory alignment, you shorten validation timelines. You reduce repeat testing, you prevent rework, you eliminate guesswork from tech transfer, you avoid inspection delays, you create predictability in your development roadmap.
That's what ultimately drives speed. Not cutting corners, but avoiding missteps.
And that's exactly why companies partner with Emma International. Not because they don't have great engineers, they do, but because they need engineers who think in alignment with auditors, regulators, and global compliance standards. They need a team that knows how to design processes that won't just work today, but will still be defensible 5 years from now. When a regulator asks, "Show me how you validated this."
Engineering support isn't about stepping in for internal teams. It's about strengthening them, giving them bandwidth, and ensuring every activity, every test, every document, every validation moves them closer to market, not further away.
In the end, engineering is the bridge between concept and compliance. It's where ideas become reality and where innovation becomes something regulators can trust. And for life sciences companies navigating high stakes environments, that bridge has to be solid.
That's what makes this kind of engineering support not only valuable, but mission critical.
As we wrap up today's episode, the takeaway is simple. In life sciences, engineering is never just engineering. It's quality, it's compliance, it's strategy. And when those pieces come together, companies don't just launch products, they build longevity.
If you'd like to learn more about how Emma International supports engineering teams through CQV, automation, design controls, process optimization, and full lifecycle guidance, you can visit mainternational.com or reach out to us directly.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay focused, and keep driving innovation forward.